You are watching my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to talk about conceptualizing communication points of divergence. In this regard, today's the topic of our discussion is communication and intention. An active debate in conceptualizing communication is whether communication is intentional or unintentional. In other words, whether we call all those activities which are intentional as communication or unintentional activities are also called communication. In this regard, many years ago, Yousaf and his colleagues wrote a very influential book. This book was cited highly because of its one phrase than the rest of the all combined book. The name of this book was Pragmatics of Human Communication. The phrase which was very popular in this book goes like this: you cannot not communicate. You cannot not communication means meaning is inherent in all human behaviors. In other words, we never fail to communicate in social interactions. Let's take an example to understand you cannot not communicate. Let's consider an individual who puts on an old pair of blue jeans because that day there was nothing else to wear in his cupboard, and then he goes to attend a class. Now, according to Yousaf and his colleagues, this behavior is called communication because other people can derive a variety of meanings from this. Some people may take it as disrespect for the authorities, others may call it peer conformity. However, this perspective has a lot of criticism. According to Michael Motley, you cannot not communicate presents communication in a very broader term. In other words, this makes communication and behavior as synonymous or nearly synonymous. Likewise, some other scholars like Berggruen and Ruffner and Miller also disagree with you cannot not communicate perspective. They think that only intentional behaviors can be termed as communication. In this way, we can say that only those behaviors constitute as communication where there is an intentional purpose present in the mind of the source. This perspective can be best understood by taking the view of all these three scholars like Motley, G.R. Miller, and Berggruen and Ruffner. G.R. Miller puts this perspective in more explicit way. She says that all those situations in which a source transmits a message to the receiver with an intentional mind or with an intention to change the behavior of the receiver are called communication. From this perspective, a defining feature which differentiates behavior from communication is that we move from behavior to communication when there is an intention. I mean, if intention is present, then we call that communication is taking place. If there is no intention, we say that there is no communication. To differentiate these two, this concept, there are two important components or two important topics which we need to differentiate. One is the source and other is receiver. The discussion about the source and the receiver revived in the early 90s. An important component in the revival of this debate was distinction between the source perspective and receiver perspective. From source and receiver based perspectives, we can divide scholars into two kinds. One of them presents a source perspective, while the other group of scholars advocate receiver perspective. Let's first talk about the source perspective. According to Michael Motley, the source perspective, because Michael Motley is the scholar which represents a source perspective. According to this perspective, an intent or intentional on the part of the receiver is important while communication to take place. According to Michael Motley, a receiver-oriented intention is important for communication to take place. while according to receiver perspective, which is advocated by James Anderson, if a receiver receives a message and interprets that message meaningfully, then we say that communication has taken place. Let's take the same old example of putting on old blue jeans and going to class. According to a source-based perspective, this behavior is not called communication, because the source doesn't have intention to communicate with the receiver. While from a receiver-based perspective, this behavior may be called communication. If the professor and the students consider the wearing of the old blue jean as the choice of the students, then we say that communication has taken place, otherwise there is no communication taking place. Now, this is very important. From source perspective and receiver perspective, there are two very important points. First, that intention is very important, because intentionality is an important component which makes communication a communication or a behavior. Let's move forward. The debate about source perspective and receiver perspective is still with us. However, in 2002, Burgoon and Hobler presented a resolution to this debate. They proposed a message perspective to resolve the debate of source-oriented communication and receiver-oriented communication. From these message perspectives, we can divide communication, or we can consider communication all those messages which work or function as a meaningful message or communication in any given speech community. We term them as communication. Burgoon and his colleagues further elaborate that if any message is encoded deliberately and the receiver interprets that message meaningfully, then we call this as communication. According to them, it doesn't matter that either this message is encoded or decoded consciously or unconsciously. To make distinction between a message perspective, there are three kinds of messages which are important to understand. One of them is called symptomatic behavior or messages. The other one is called analogical behavior, and the third one is called verbal behavior. Let's talk about these three kinds of behaviors one by one. The example, which is very easy, I will cite here to make distinction between these three kinds of behaviors. Suppose you are talking to your friend on a mobile phone and you feel tired. Because of your fatigue, you give an uncontrollable yawn. We call these kind of messages as symptomatic messages. The examples of these kind of messages include stomach growling, scratching, and other automatic responses. While in analogical messages, take same example, you are talking to your friend on a mobile and you are tired. And you give a fake yawn to communicate to your friend that you feel tired and you want to get off the call. These kind of messages are called analogical messages. Let's now talk about verbal messages. Same example. If you are talking to your friend on a mobile and you are tired, and because of your fatigue, you communicate to your friend that you feel tired and you want to get off the phone call. This is called verbal messages. Now, there is a very important distinction which we need to make between these three kind of messages to understand them in more thorough way. In symptomatic behaviors, there is no intention involved. While in analogical messages, there is both in analogical messages and verbal messages, there is an intention on the part of the source to communicate to the receiver. This is the first part. The second part, we can further say that analogical messages are automatic imitation or intentional imitation of symptomatic messages. Now, this move to message perspective from the source perspective and receiver perspective is important for several reasons. One of them is that in analogical communication, or if we talk about analogical messages, it explicates that most of communication is analogical in nature. where there is conscious imitation of communication behavior. Secondly, the most important thing is the debate of intentionality. It means most of the time, whether it's a source-oriented or receiver-oriented, intention or consciousness is present in our communication. So let's now move to the last part. What is the conclusion? I mean, whether communication is intentional or unintentional. In this regard, still we don't have any consensus that either communication is an intentional activity or unintentional activities, because from Verslovic and his colleagues' perspective, behavior and communication are synonymous, and from Michael Motley's perspective, communication is only that kind of activity where there is conscious intent on the part of the source, which is directed towards the receiver to change the behavior of the receiver, while James Anderson advocates the receiver perspective, and yet another perspective which is proposed by Bergoon and his colleagues, they talk about the message perspective. However, the recent debate about conceptualizing communication has evolved into very sophisticated debates. There is not a single perspective to understand communication. Rather, there should be multiple perspectives to understand and define the diversity present in the communication field. In this regard, we need to understand that evaluating communication in terms of correctness or incorrectness is not a good way to move forward. Rather, the best way is to evaluate communications in terms of their utility, to understand any given communication phenomena. In this regards, a suggestion given by James Anderson on page 309 of his book titled Communication Theory, Epistemological Foundations is a very pragmatic one. James Anderson proposes that these perspectives launch scholars on different theoretical trajectories, predispose them to ask distinct questions, and set them to conduct different kind of communication research in the discipline of communication. What does this mean? This means that James Anderson wants to say or want to elaborate that communication is a discipline. To appreciate the variety, diversity in this field, we need to use multiple perspectives to understand communication phenomena. This is all about today. If you find this talk interesting, don't forget to give your feedback.